Jared, thank you very much for being here. How have you seen the way that agencies think about risk for waste, fraud, and abuse change? And how are the technology tools that we've been talking about so far in this program applicable to the way those agencies think about their risks?
Yeah, I think, the government has been struggling with, fraud and fraud risk for as, time eternal. Going back to the 80s, actually, they were using like large data sets to find certain types of fraud. But as that technology improves, it becomes sort of the bar lowers in terms of what you're able to jump over to sort of find ways to detect fraud. And there was a lot of excitement as data became cheaper to store and easier to manage. And I think what's been really cool recently to see is more of this time, instead of like looking for fraud being this sort of skunkworks thing that sort of happens over somewhere else, and then you sort of throw over the fence and hope someone catches it. A lot more attempts to sort of bake it into processes. So, building something that the people who are on the ground can use, right? Rather than something that someone in some lab sort of put together or some, research group, and then sort of hopefully someone can take up. So I think GAO is a big proponent of this. They have the fraud risk management framework that sort of outlines how agencies can go about this. And I do think there's been a lot of progress, but still agencies, even to this day, think, oh, we don't have any fraud. That's like someone else's problem, And so at GAO, that's one of the big things we push is, really look seriously at your programs, look at the types of frauds that can occur, and make sure you take steps that can sort of understand that risk and, create actions to mitigate that risk. One thing we're seeing is, at the Treasury, for example, they've got the do not pay list, and more agencies are hooked up to that. And again, they can bake that into their processes. So when they're reviewing these transactions, they're sort of bouncing against this list and taking follow-up action. So that's what I see. And it was discussed sort of the speed of mission. And I think to me, that's what I sort of see the goals is understanding the risk and then building tools that people can use without interrupting, their workflows. Yeah.
How much of what you are seeing and what you described there has been driven by technological evolution, and how much of it has been driven by policy change, agendas inside agencies to try to mitigate waste, fraud, and abuse, that kind of thing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I think you really need both, right? Like having all the technology in the world isn't going to help you if you don't know where your fraud risks are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think the agencies that are doing best now are starting and saying, okay, where are the fraud risks and what specific data do we need to capture those risks? So that, you don't want to just say, well, it's not like if you build it, they will come. Like that doesn't work, and they're talking about data lakes turning to data swamps. And I think that's one of these things like 15 years ago, we saw, which is, okay, if we put all the data in one place, human ingenuity will just reveal the problems. And humans are pretty ingenious, but when you have that much data, you need direction. Yeah. And so I think that's really what you're seeing is having those access to those data, but in addition, having the ideas of, okay, here's what our fraud risks are, and here's the data we need, and building these seamless tools so that you can get the risks in the hands of the people who can act on those risks.
Mm-hmm. So the risks obviously are different at every agency. Is the data that an agency uses to understand its risk the same, and therefore does one process it the same, or does that vary agency to agency, mission to mission also?
Yeah, no, that's a great question as well. So I think there's certain things, and as I mentioned, the Treasury do not pay list, where there's sort of these general sort of ideas that all agencies share, when making payments, and like the person should be alive, for example, and so I think there's sort of these uniform tools and methods, but most of it is very agency dependent. And some agencies have enormous hurdles, right, because of the volume of the data, right? Other agencies have hurdles because of the complexity of the data. So I think it's very important that agencies understand what their risks are and what data infrastructures and tools that they can, but then also understanding what some of these larger scale tools that they can take advantage of, So I think it's sort of a hybrid between the individual requirements and then these broader requirements.
A lot of conversation on this program today and broadly across the government space about the importance of technology modernization, transformation, evolution, number of different terms to describe it, and also a lot of discussion about data. What are the steps that you see successful organizations taking to combine all of those things, or to create an intersection that winds up giving them results in both the risk mitigation itself and then in the actual manifestation of waste, fraud, and abuse?
Yeah, and I think the first step is just acknowledging that fraud can be a problem, right? And not presuming that if it's not banging on the door, that it doesn't exist. And you can see there's certain agencies that have like almost do full investigations on a random set of claims to understand the fraud risk, and it's kind of fascinating to look at those. Some of the UI does that. Unemployment insurance, and so you'll see there's states that the fraud is very low, and suddenly it spikes up to 15%, and then but if they weren't monitoring that, you would have there's nothing external in the news or anything to really highlight that. So I think the first thing is agencies that acknowledge that can be a problem, and then second, sort of assign sort of an individual whose job it is to sort of understand the fraud risk, research the fraud risk, and build a strategy. And then from there, you then look at what data you need in order to detect the frauds, related to that, the risks that you've identified. And so I think that's intentionality, and then taking it seriously, setting up an individual, and then working closely with the IT. I think that's a big issue. Is as much as progress as agencies have made, there's still so much trouble with government data, and understanding those limitations, and where you can take, we have limited resources and deploy those limited resources in a way that most helps with the fraud.
You referenced before we started this conversation, you referenced large language models as an important tool for agencies to understand what their fraud risks are. How does that work? What's the connection there?
Yeah, so I think it'll be interesting to see where this goes. It's so 10 years ago, if you say, oh, we got a narrative, okay, from someone wrote in an application, what can we do to use that for fraud detection? And you could try to like compress the narrative with some sort of like complicated statistical model, but it was very limited in what you could do. And I think we're on the cusp of something. You could have a program, large language model, read a narrative and say, hey, that's suspicious that someone who's 85 years old would start a lawn business in the winter, and then that lawn business would be stopped because of COVID. That's a real case. You can sort of give that scenario and say, what do you think about this? Now, I think there's a lot of hurdles, right? Like large language models, hallucinate, they make up things, it's expensive to use them. But I think that potential to take some of these different pieces that someone needs to have sort of, I wouldn't say large language models understand, but in that model, there's the connections between these ideas, and then apply that. I think there's a lot of potential there. Now, how close are we to that playing out? I don't know. It might be a while to really make it actionable, but it's something new, and I think it's fascinating given that 10 years ago it would be crazy, to think that you could do that, and we're getting closer.
Is it tempting to think about these tools in the wrong way? And what I mean by that is we're thinking about, the way you just described it, you called it accurately a large language model tool. There are artificial intelligence tools, and there are all different kinds of other things. But when it comes right down to it, they're all data analytics tools. And I think back to what you said at the beginning of this discussion about when data lakes first started to form in the 80s, there was no way to really parse them. Now we have more and more advanced ways to parse them. Am I oversimplifying it, or is it really just the way that people are looking at it, thinking about this conceptually, that will lead to better results?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability to take unstructured data and pull it together and form conclusions to me is one of the newest things that is possible now. And so I think you working through these technical limitations of these tools, like the hallucinations and things like that, and then finding where their limits are, right? But to me, it's amazing that you could give a model all this disparate data and say, where are the fraud risks, right? And have the tool give you information that then could be integrated with a work process. Yeah.
I'll ask you the same thing as we wrap up that I've asked other folks today, and that is, when you go in and talk to folks in agencies, what do you tell them that they should maybe be thinking about over the horizon? Are there common recommendations that you and your colleagues make about where agencies should think about being regarding these tools a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's like the foundations, really. Is there's these really cool tools, but to be able to use these tools in the future, you need to have a fraud risk strategy. You need to have your data that's reliable and connected to your mission need and with the people who are making the decisions. So to me, that's the core thing, is making sure you have the foundation now that as these tools mature, you're ready to use those tools.
Jared, it's great to have you here. I really enjoyed talking to you about this issue.
No, this was great. Thank you.